Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this roundtable on following the money and financial accountability in the fight against human trafficking. I am Ruchira Gupta, founder of the NGO Apne Aap, a grassroots organization that works in India and New York to end sex trafficking by reaching the most vulnerable women and girls before traffickers do. We are meeting today in the wake of the Epstein investigation, and we are beginning right here in New York. New York was not simply a backdrop to the Epstein web, it was part of the enabling environment. This city brought together the banks, lawyers, real estate interests, political donors, academics, art dealers, philanthropists, agents, brokers, and financiers who gave Epstein access, legitimacy, and cover. Survivors are still fighting for justice. But New York must also ask, what has changed? What safety nets have been created for vulnerable girls and women since the Epstein case has unraveled and since we know what a big hub New York was? What accountability systems exist for institutions that enable exploitation? What can actually look after audits, procurement, pension oversight, and corporate accountability? What can we do to prevent trafficking? For more than 3 decades, I have worked with women and girls who have been bought and sold. I have learned that trafficking is not only a crime of violence, it is also a crime of money, systems, access, and silence. Today, we will ask what it means for New York to follow the money. I am honored to be joined by 3 panelists. Taina Bien-Aimé, Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, who brings a global feminist and abolitionist lens to sexual exploitation and demand. Alexi Meyers, Director of Anti-Trafficking Policy at the Sanctuary for Families and co-chair of the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition, who will help us understand New York's policy landscape, survivor services, and gaps. Goyle, candidate for New York State Comptroller, who will speak to how the Comptroller's office can use audits, procurement, pension oversight, contracts, and public spending to strengthen accountability. We will begin with short remarks from each speaker and then move into a moderated conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Apne Aap is proud to host this roundtable at this opportune moment when the Comptroller's office is up for grabs. Who should that person be? And that is why we are hosting this roundtable today. Taina, I would like to begin with you. You have spent decades challenging sexual exploitation and the demand that fuels it. In the wake of Epstein, how should we understand this case before one individual offender? What does it reveal about demand impunity and the institutions that normalize exploitation?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Ruchira and Apne Aap, for inviting me. It's so nice to see familiar faces and new friends on this webinar. It's a very timely conversation, so I'm honored to be here. So just as a reminder, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women is a 501c3 organization, and although we are honored to share the screen with the controller candidate, we cannot endorse or support any political candidates. So we are joining you just from an informational and conversational capacity. And I know everyone is already very much entrenched in fighting for an end to sexual violence, sexual exploitation, prostitution, and sex trafficking of women and girls in particular. So, so thank you for including us in this continued journey. So yes, when we talk about the Jeffrey Epstein case, it's obviously a very stark case study rather than an isolated anomaly. I mean, it definitely, what the Epstein case has shown us and continues to show us is how deeply entrenched power structures, institutional complicity, and also the harmful narratives in society about consent and male sexual entitlement and sexual violence against women and girls are just seeped into our daily lives. We see all the aspects of the sex trade as harmful cultural practices, that sustain the sex trade, perpetuate impunity, and normalize the sexual exploitation of vulnerable populations, especially marginalized women and girls. I once asked one of the deputy directors of UN Women, a Swedish woman, why our work is so hard in persuading the powers that be and society in general about the harms of prostitution and how it's linked to sex trafficking and all that. And without missing a beat, she said, sex, power, and money. And money there is. So the International Labor Organization, the ILO, estimates profits from the global sex trade at about 240 billion a year, but that amount is probably double, if not triple, given that the ILO excludes many, many aspects of the sex trade. We know that it is the fastest growing, that sex trafficking is the fastest growing crime globally, according to the UN. The vast majority of people who are trafficked for purposes of sexual exploitation are women and girls, at a level of anywhere between 92 or 94% of people who are trafficked for sexual exploitation are women and girls. So it is a gender crime, and what we do is work at the local, national, and international level to ensure that laws are in place or laws are implemented to prevent the sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, but also to end this. I'm just giving a broad view before I go into the Epstein case about sort of the laws that we promote, which has many names. It's called the Swedish Nordic Equality Survivor Abolitionist Model that basically ends the criminalization and arrest of women or people in prostitution, holds sex buyers accountable for the enormous harm and crimes they commit, and also offers services, comprehensive services, which Alexi will talk about, to sex trade survivors. But it also has an educational component, if done right, where the government really invests in helping the public and society understand that prostitution and the sexual exploitation of women and girls are forms of gender-based violence and discrimination and not exceptions to it. So when we look at the sort of architecture of demand within the Epstein case, it does, I mean, it's casebook study for an understanding that paid for sexual acts, the acceptance of it is not only stitched in our culture, but it's a highly organized structural force that's accepted by the powers that govern us. And here in New York, from the mayor's office to the New York legislature, even in the governor's office and everywhere in between. And then you also have sort of the corporate media and entertainment conglomerates that shape our understanding or our recognition of sexual exploitation as something that's glamorous, or at least, a desirable quote unquote job for impoverished and marginalized women. So I'll give you an example. So if many of you are moviegoers and you've seen movies like The Hustlers with Jennifer Lopez, which is set in a strip club, or Enora, a movie that won a number of Oscars a couple of years ago, there's a high chance that the movie watcher recognizes on screen the violence, the exploitation, the dehumanization, the degradation, the abuse. I mean, it is clear, like every set will show how these women are actually suffering, and they are not in these situations by choice, that they're extremely vulnerable and marginalized. But then you've got the entire public relations machinery, the movie critics, the PR campaigns that promote the films. I mean, those of us who are in New York, like NPR, just had a red carpet rollout to promote films like Hustler or Enora, that tells the listener or the viewer that actually what you saw was not violence or exploitation, that these are stories that are empowering, they're about girl bosses, these women are badasses, who control their lives and their choices. So then you have this total cognitive dissonance in the public. And so what is that? How does that shape our laws and policies? How does that shape our understanding of sexual exploitation? People are asking, did I really see the violence, or was it actually fun and a certain, fun that was guided and controlled by the women who were being exploited? And I don't think that's a quirk. I think it's a calculated strategy by systems of power, including corporate power, to normalize and mainstream sexual violence as entertainment, because so much money is involved and a lot of people are making a lot of money from it. And it's also part of the significant backlash against the advancement of women's rights, however slow they've been, and women's fight for equality. So just going back to sexual exploitation as a currency of power, I think the Epstein operation also demonstrated how the commodification of women and girls function as social currency among elites. So when we look at the demand and we look at who is in the Epstein class, it's driven by a network of very, very high status buyers, the tippy top of society and corporate world and governments, et cetera, who view the bodies of vulnerable young women, especially, as resources for personal gratification. And then I'll just two more comments. Like, one example is the example of the former Norwegian foreign minister, Børge Brende, who had to resign from his role as president and CEO of the World Economic Forum when he was found in the Epstein files, very cozy with Epstein. So the World Economic Forum is held every year in Davos, Switzerland. It brings the elite of the elite of the elite in financial and government institutions. And it's interesting to note that for 2 years in a row, a few years ago, escort agencies in Davos had to issue press releases to tell the participants of Davos that they had run out of women. They were like, boys, we are sold out for the next 2 weeks. It was reported that they had to helicopter women in to fill the gap from the oversubscription of escort services. So again, it's a follow the dots, connect the dots, follow the links, whatever language you want to use to show how difficult it is to dismantle these structures of power. And then one final point on systemic grooming and recruitment. So there's this book by a journalist named Sophie Gilbert that's called Girl on Girl: How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Women Against Themselves. Unfortunately, she uses the terminology of quote unquote sex work in her book, but it's a very, very powerful book that examines how the pornification of women and girls in all aspects of our media, from fashion magazines to Hollywood movies, have exacerbated the growth of a toxic environment where women are transformed into objects designed for male consumption. So when you, again, going back to the Epstein class, you have companies like Victoria's Secrets, The Limited, all of those owners were linked to Epstein. When you look at foundations, Gates, that's a 2-hour conversation to talk about not only the relationship of Gates with Epstein, but his relationship as head of the Gates Foundation into the development of the commercial sex trade and the growth of brothels. And Ruchira is an expert on that in India, including the birth of quote unquote, or at least supporting the growth of what is known as sex workers unions, et cetera. So there was one young woman on Instagram who said, when you look at all of the structures of power and influence within the Epstein class and how it trickles down and who was influencing the girlhoods of so many women, she was like, they weren't just grooming the girls who were destined for Epstein Island, they were grooming all of us. And so I'll stop here and give the floor to my wonderful colleague, Alexi. But yes, much to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Taina. I now want to turn to Alexi Meyers, Director of Anti-Trafficking Policy at Sanctuary for Families and co-chair of the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition. Alexi, you work directly on New York's anti-trafficking policy landscape. What has New York done well, and where are the gaps? What safety nets still need to be built for survivors and vulnerable girls before traffickers reach them? Alexi, the floor is yours for 7 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I want to start by saying New York has done a lot well. We have built one of the strongest anti-trafficking legal frameworks in the country. We are driven by a robust survivor-led movement. I'll give you a little bit of history. In 2004, Sanctuary for Families, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, now New York City, my sister's place, a bunch of organizations and survivors joined forces to create the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition. And through sustained advocacy, they secured a lot of landmark legislation. The 2007 Anti-Trafficking Law, which defined sex and labor trafficking that was beyond physical force. It acknowledged that traffickers use a myriad of forces and techniques to traffic women and girls. It clarified promoting prostitution offenses, which included sex tourism and brothel keeping, which was huge at the time. It elevated sex buying from a B to an A misdemeanor, which is also huge in acknowledging that the demand for prostitution is the driving force. And it extended services to immigrant survivors. In 2008, they passed the Safe Harbor Act, which shifted the response to sexually exploited minors from prosecution to protection. A huge step towards the equality model and towards acknowledging that children could not be prostitutes or sex workers, but that they are victims. In 2015, we passed the TVPJA, which recognized that buying children for sex is child abuse. It expanded prosecutorial tools. It eliminated stigmatizing language in the statute, and it provided trafficking survivors a defense against prostitution charges. In 2018, this is when I started working on policy. We enacted the End Child Sex Trafficking Law. This removed the requirement that child victims have to prove force when acknowledging that traffickers exploit trauma and fear of retaliation, not just physical coercion. It also acknowledged that children aren't always able to testify against their traffickers, that they have trauma bonds, that there's many reasons why they don't. In 2023, we enacted the START Act, which enabled survivors to vacate convictions that result from their exploitation. My organization, Sanctuary, has filed scores of applications and witnessed the transformation firsthand that these convictions really had as barriers to employment, education, housing. And so that was huge. And just 2 weeks ago, we passed the Child Sex Buyer Accountability Act. This makes soliciting sex from a 15, 16, or 17-year-old a felony. New York was one of the last states to enact this. It was still a misdemeanor to solicit sex from a minor. And I really think that's left over from the days where we still arrested 16 and 17-year-olds for prostitution rather than acknowledging them as victims. All of these laws reflect an equality model approach. We are inching towards it. We recognize that prostitution and trafficking are inextricably linked, like Taina talked about. We want to end the criminalization of victims and strengthen accountability for buyers and exploiters. But we still have a long way to go to achieving that. So that brings me to what safety nets are still missing. It is still criminal in New York to engage in prostitution. This undermines everything else. When survivors fear arrest, they don't access services, they don't cooperate with law enforcement, they're re-traumatized when they're arrested. It's the only crime in the penal code where we arrest the victim of the crime. And it's really tantamount to arresting a victim of rape just because she was there at the time of the rape. And then a hugely important gap is that buyers operate with impunity. While sex buying is technically illegal in New York, law enforcement is virtually non-existent on this issue. Trafficking is a market. Markets respond to price signals. Right now, the price of buying a human being for sex is effectively zero. Taina talked about it being a $200 billion a year industry. Well, every dollar of that is paid to the traffickers. It's paid by the sex buyer. And if we want to stop trafficking, we very quite simply have to stop paying for it. So one thing New York could do is use online enforcement tools. The internet is now the primary marketplace for sex buying, though there are still areas where street prostitution exists. But New York law enforcement needs to use modern tools, and they exist. One tool, for example, is called Street Grace. It's a collaboration with Microsoft volunteers and law enforcement, and they developed an app called Transaction Intercept. It's AI-powered technology that identifies buyers of minors. It removes their anonymity. It disrupts the transaction at scale without a lot of manpower, and it stores buyer information in law enforcement's criminal files. New York should be funding and deploying this model statewide. We need to institute income proportional penalties. This is something that has been used in Sweden and in France to deter buyers. Flat fines for sex buying doesn't create real deterrence. If we institute these income proportional penalties, you can charge much higher for high-end buyers like the hedge fund market, the Epsteins. And then it will also generate revenue for survivor services. New York, I would say, has insufficient services. Well, in New York City, Sanctuary for Families has partnered with New York Health and Hospitals to create the Empower Center. This is a hospital-embedded walk-in multi-service program that provides free trauma-informed medical, clinical, legal, and case management services to anyone with experience in the commercial sex trade. This model works, and it should be replicated in every major jurisdiction and rural upstate communities where trafficking is most often visible. And finally, I think New York needs a statewide human trafficking coordinator who's tasked with ensuring that survivors know what services exist, how to access them, and to make sure that these services are adequately funded. So it's an infrastructure gap with straightforward public finance solution, a funded coordinator position with real authority and accountability. I will leave it there for now.
Thanks, Alexi. That was super useful, a long list, but very doable. I now want to turn to Raj Goyle. He's the candidate for New York State Comptroller. I've known him for a long time, especially because he was one of the early allies who fought sex trafficking by noticing what was happening online and wanted and did campaign to protect children from online sexual abuse. Raj, most people do not immediately connect the Comptroller's office with anti-trafficking work, but the office has tools that matter: audits, procurement, oversight, pension fund stewardship, public contracts, and corporate accountability. How can these tools be used to fight trafficking and strengthen protection for vulnerable women and children? And what will you do if you get elected?
Well, thanks, Ruchira. Good morning, everybody. It's a deep, deep honor to be here, to be in your presence. I honor and admire your work, stand on all your shoulders. I think, Ruchira, you definitely you put it diplomatically when you said most people are unaware of the Comptroller's office. I would say that most people are unaware of what the Comptroller, that it exists, let alone what it could obviously do in this very, very important pressing issue. I do, to Taina's point, I do want to make a point here. Obviously, I realize this is a C3 environment here, and so I'll be speaking purely on the policy issues that we've discussed here today, and then, of course, the substance of what can be done, and of course, not engage in anything that's partisan here. I'd like to make a couple prefatory comments, and then specifically around what I believe that the office could do But as Ruchira mentioned, my experience is unlike many of you. I am not working actively in the field, but I would consider myself adjacent and ally, of course, a strong ally to the cause. And so one of the things when I was running a small legal technology company, I was surprised that this is back in 2018, I believe is what Ruchira is referring to. Now, of course, the politics and the environment around big tech has shifted massively. But 10 years ago, if you recall, the Google saying was "Don't be evil." Technology was actually viewed, and the big tech companies were viewed as unalloyed goods, or good forces for good. And in fact, one of the very first things that was happening, this is again almost 10 years ago, the big technology companies, which we didn't even have the term, the platforms at the time, they were fighting basic sex trafficking regulations. They didn't want any obligation whatsoever. And many of you may know about Section 230, which of course absolves the technology communities, companies and the platforms from any legal liability whatsoever. Many have called that one of probably the greatest corporate giveaway in the history of the country, and perhaps in all of time. And so that's why, and I've learned a lot just listening carefully, but what Alexi was mentioning about the online platforms is so important. So back even about 8 years ago, I was a CEO of a small technology company, and I was willing to go on the record criticizing the technology CEOs who, again, at the time, they weren't criticized anywhere, saying, we have really gotten out of whack and lost our way, that we don't even want to hold these companies accountable for something as vicious and as vile as sex trafficking. And that leads me to this larger point, which I would say that I am still surprised, having been in the political space for several decades now. I turned 51 last week. I know I don't look a day over 50. But I am shocked and remain perplexed and saddened that this is not an issue of political salience that is not yet a front page issue. And I think everything, Taina, thank you for that. I mean, I think that the message around how pop culture essentially validates and does not make the criticism apparent. And Alexi, to your point about the market, and I think that's so well said, the soundbite there, which is like the price is zero for buying a human being, and we have so internalized this as a society. And I would say specifically, this has nothing to do with the office I'm running for or anything. I'm talking as a political observer. The political space has been absolutely, in my view, absent and completely asleep at the switch of calling this out for what it is. And I do think I happened, years ago, in fact, I had good friends who were criticizing the Epstein decision in Florida, well before he became a household name. I am close friends with Ro Khanna, and of course, Ro and soon to be former Congressman Massey did, yeoman's work uncovering the files. But and I believe in the Times just today there is new information. I was reading it in the car around Epstein's death and new information. So this seems like this will continue to be a font of constant information. But this concept of the Epstein class and what the elites have done when it comes to sex trafficking, I do hope marshals in a new political era, but I wouldn't bank on it. I still think that there is a mountain to climb here to make this a front page political issue in which everybody condemns it, but it requires real resources, real money, and a political consensus that this must be elevated onto the political stage. And I still think that's lacking. Very specifically, in terms of what the Comptroller's office could do, the Comptroller, just to back up for one quick second, it runs a $300 billion pension fund, the New York State Common Retirement Fund. There's about 1.3 million lives in New York and retirees. The second is that the State Comptroller is a state auditor. Can you imagine this? Every dollar of state contracts is under the jurisdiction of this office. And the third is the office of the state treasurer, moves the money, signs the paychecks. In many states, this is 3 separate jobs. Due to a quirk in New York, it is one job under the state comptroller, empowered by the state constitution. And another wrinkle, for those of you who may have, be in the financial world at all, which is it's a sole trusteeship. So unlike the New York City pension fund, which is actually 5 pensions with a very complicated board structure, this office has empowered one person, the holder of that office, to be the trustee and the decision maker for that $300 billion. So if activated and if used to its full extent, I believe this office could be transformational on the issue of sex trafficking, not only for the political salience that I mentioned, but also for the financial markets point that Alexi made. And so, very specifically, the state comptroller should be ensuring through the audits of all state contracts that not a dollar is going through, asking a very simple question, can you prove that operations and subcontractors are free of trafficking? This should be a front burner. This should be a criteria that is indisputable. The second thing is that you can actually follow the money. Because that is actually, what the job of the comptroller is. So as we've already heard from the panelists, of course, the hotels, the transportation, the massage parlors, and so on, this should be a steady trail of following the money. And as the comptroller's office, that should be laying that out. Not simply in some sort of passive way, and I don't think, to my knowledge, that the current incumbent, who's been in that office for 20 years, has done a comprehensive audit of this issue. I think there's been some nibbling around the edges. The third is with that $300 billion pension fund, and this really gets to the core of the Davos point and the Epstein class point, which is there is literally thousands of companies, asset managers that are invested in by the state pension fund. And the New York State Pension Fund is sort of the leading pension fund because of the sole trusteeship. So if simply, you may or may not know this, but in red states, the chief financial officers, they have a common organization. It's called the SFOF, the State Financial Officers Foundation. You won't be surprised that on the progressive side, this is lacking. There is no such political infrastructure. Imagine if the pension funds pooled our leverage, we're talking trillions of dollars, and went out to the markets and said, in the same way that we will not allow you, at one point we allowed child labor in this country. At one point, we did so many things that we now view as immoral. Thankfully, there is a consensus that's emerging on guns. Again, there's a red-blue divide, but there is no such still consensus that would say we will use our economic leverage to simply mandate that we will require accountability and reporting from the companies that we invest in. This is actually not that difficult. It is effective regulation, but it's actually a public-private partnership in a way, which is to say that we invest these dollars in these private companies. We must ensure compliance. And so these, to me, and then I'll lastly say that when you have the third highest ranking position in a state with 19 million people, obviously New York being the media capital, there needs to just be, this gets back to where I began, there just needs to be more public attention to this issue. I will say, as somebody, again, who doesn't work in the field actively or on a daily basis, when I saw the I guess you would call them alerts in airport bathrooms, in which over the last few years, in which I saw the advertising that said, if you are a victim of trafficking, call so-and-so, that spurred a conversation in my family, among friends, because it was drawing it out of the shadows. It was using essentially public awareness to spur a public conversation. And that's going well beyond people in the advocacy community, people in legislation, people and so on. So I do believe, again, I'll end I'll end where I began and where Taina began, which is the cultural moment that we're in also requires political engagement. And so the unanimity and the unequivocal voice of the political class, in my view, is what's needed here, is to bring this issue continually out of the shadows. That fact about Davos and the Super Bowl and when there are these big, large events, and the fact that we know that the market, again, to Alexi's great point, it's a market, the market spikes. We should be having market-based solutions to this moral crisis. And the fact that the political class does not recognize it as a moral failing of our country, we use morality in our language all the time. We say it's immoral that we don't have health insurance. It's immoral that ICE is terrorizing our communities. It's immoral that we don't have a more balanced system and that 1 in 7 kids in New York City public schools is homeless. We say that's immoral, and yes, it is immoral. But yet there is not enough, in my view, of that language and attention to this issue. So certainly we'll see what happens in the election, of course, and we're not here to talk about the election, but I do believe that the political class needs to step up and has been woefully absent outside policy experts and technocratic solutions, but the political moment is still yet to arrive.
Thank you, Raj. That was pretty brilliant. And what you have effectively done today by joining this roundtable is set the agenda for any comptroller now who will have this list to follow. So thank you for doing that. And
Ruchira, if I could mention, whatever happens in the election next Tuesday, obviously I'm keen to win, but I do hope that whomever is the state comptroller and whomever is a state treasurer in any state, in any city, in any locality, I do believe, and I will say, I hope that they need to act on this, as you said, to lay out this agenda. And I do believe that as an advocacy community and as a former state legislator, legislatures are often the focus of political advocacy by advocates, but I do think this has been an overlooked role, that the advocacy community should focus on the financial officers of states, counties, and localities and get action there in concert with legislators.
absolutely. And because, the Epstein class was basically operating, channeling money laundering, using money to incentivize, and the whole web was created around money, actually. And if we don't follow the money, we can never challenge the Epstein class. It'll just be another Epstein and another Epstein, and probably there are 1,000 Epsteins out there. So unless we take action where it hurts, we will not be able to tackle the Epstein class. So thank you to all three of you. I want to bring the conversation together now to one more thing. I will ask all those who are listening in to please, if you have any questions for any of the speakers, put it into chat. And if we have any time left over, I will read the question to the speakers. In the meantime, I will just ask each speaker to make one comment each before I open up the floor to questions from the audience. So Taina, I'll begin with you. Keep it very short so that we can give time to the audience to ask questions as well. If you want to just make any important point you think that you left out or want to still say.
Thank you, Ruchira, and I'll try to be as short as possible. It's actually a question for Raj with respect to audits in New York City. So let's, and again, we go back into the culture and how hard it is to target these human rights violations when the culture is so accepting of sexual exploitation. And the case in point are strip clubs in New York. In New York City, which are legal institutions. Any survivor will tell you it was the launching pad into the system of prostitution. They are recognized in New York City as employees. We know that the patterns in those sex clubs violate New York City labor laws in terms of sex discrimination, harassment, dehumanization. So in terms of audit, it would be very interesting to sort of look at the patterns and the profit streams of strip clubs. Good assignment for the next city controller, and also an overview of the cost of the sex trade in New York City. So France had done a preliminary report on the costs of prostitution. We know how many pizza places there are in the city. We don't know how many commercial sex establishments there are. And so, yes, when we talk about audits, I think, and if we want to have an understanding of how the money flows and how the power structures work in the field of sexual exploitation, we definitely need to have a full-scale financial audit on the system in New York City.
I like
Would
that.
you like me to comment on that, or?
Yes, Raj, please go ahead.
I'll say very briefly because I know I'm here from Alexi. Couldn't agree more. I think these foundational audits. I've spoken about this a lot in the context of universal childcare, which is having run a business as well. What is the cost to our economy and GDP of lacking universal childcare? What often happens is we look at the flip of the equation. How much does the program cost? As opposed to the flip side, which is how much are we spending right now by not having this policy? So I view that as an analogy, which is, I'm running for state comptroller, not city comptroller, but the offices work closely together. And I do believe that the state comptroller would be the logical home of the audit that you suggest. And I will say I can, should we win next week, I will commit right now to such a foundational audit, because I do think that being New York, being the media capital, talking about the cost to our economy of the sex trade needs to continue to make this financial argument.
Thank you. Alexi.
I think I would just say fund what works, require accountability for what doesn't work. For example, are the programs that we're funding reaching the most vulnerable? Are they trauma-informed, survivor-led? Are they measuring outcomes that matter, which is, stability, safety, economic empowerment? And then I would really want to think about trafficking as a financial condition, vulnerability as a financial condition, poverty, housing, instability, immigration, precarity, and lack of economic alternatives are not just social problems, but they're conditions that make trafficking possible. So every dollar invested in economic stability for women and girls shrinks the pool of people that a trafficker could exploit. Every buyer who faces real consequences raises the cost of exploitation. Both of those levels matter. We need to elect people who really see prostitution as an exploitation and not as a social safety network. I often hear people in our elected government talking about prostitution as the best option for the migrant solution, migrants that have come, for vulnerable youth, even for the immigrant men who need companions. It is not that. It is none of those things. It is exploitation, and it should be treated as such.
Absolutely. And Raj, do you want to, I remember that when you were speaking in Queens a few weeks ago, you were talking about reaching the last person. And in Apne Aap, also in my NGO, we always make sure to reach the last girl. And systems which don't reach her will not uplift anyone, and protection is important. And prostitution is based on absence of choice. And that choice is often based on intersecting inequalities, because funding is not there for the last girl. So Raj, your turn now. After your comment, there's also a question for you. Anyway, you go ahead first, and then I'll ask you the question.
No, I've spoken a lot. I would simply say I do believe that, and Alexi, I take your point well around what the elected class should be. And if I could ask maybe for a little bit more clarification and information. So I hear from the political class, and I just want to make sure that I understand perfectly clearly, which is the sex worker conversation, often in terms of legislation and policy, to me goes on one direction, which is that there is an empowerment function, and therefore it should lead to a certain legislation that around legalization. And so and I hear very little again around following the money. I often hear the construct is around the criminality, the criminal justice, the CJ aspects of it, little around investigations and money and so on. So I just think, certainly maybe the audience already knows this, but I think it'd be helpful to just understand exactly where the consensus is on what the political philosophy should be around proposed legislation.
Yes. Does Alexi, do you want to answer that, or Taina, or can I ask the question? There's a question from Alia Garrett, who's just graduated from New York University. Her question is to Raj. If trafficking follows money, how should we interrogate the role of mainstream digital platforms like OnlyFans in shaping demand for commodified bodies? And where do we draw the line between empowerment and exploitation in financial oversight?
Well, I would just specifically say that that is exactly why the Comptroller's office should be more active on this issue, because that is precisely the role, our money, your money in New York State, has billions of dollars in the technology companies, in the platforms. And in fact, the pension funds are the logical advocacy path for how you can actually get reform of the platforms. And so this issue, and I think to Taina's point, the foundational audit around how much sex trafficking costs our economy, and we need to begin to reveal this information, again, I believe, for the political consensus to emerge beyond the advocacy world, but to the public at large. So the pension fund, shareholder activism audits, that's precisely the mechanisms of what the office should use, to be very simple.
I have a question, Raj. Could the Comptroller's office audit survivor services across New York and identify where public systems are failing? What would such an audit look like?
Well, any state contract, anything that where state dollars are moving through a system or an organization is subject to an audit. So short answer is I can't imagine why that wouldn't, there should not be any reason why that couldn't be audited. And those are precisely the kind of audits that should be done, systemic audits that are showing the flows of money and so on. So short answer is yes.
There's a question from Sage. She asks, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this incredible and informative panel. The question is, how can we act on a local and grassroots level here in New York? I live in Jackson Heights, which is home to Roosevelt Avenue, a well-known hotbed for traffickers, and I'd love to know more about what actions we can take at a community level to address those issues and support survivors. I think all of you can answer this. So maybe begin with Alexi, then Taina, then Raj.
Well, simply put, I just put our website in the chat at theequalitymodelnewyork.org. If you sign up for that and you'll get our newsletters, you'll see invitation to meetings and ways you can get involved, lobby days, phone banking. But we always talk about going to local meetings, to asking these questions of candidates, of your elected officials, going to the police precinct meetings. So there are so many ways, but stay connected with us, and we can guide you.
Alexi, can you type in the website into the chat?
I did.
Oh, you have. Perfect. Taina?
Yes, I wanted to answer a few questions, namely Raj's question about legislation around quote unquote sex work and legalization and decriminalization. The countries that have done so have three major goals. One, to curb human trafficking. Two, to end violence, including police violence against people in prostitution. And three, to eliminate child sex trafficking. Each of those countries have failed on all accounts. And we can have a separate conversation to give you examples of those failures. The challenge in New York is, again, it's all about cultural narrative. So there's no conversation about the perpetrators. It's always about whether or not the person enjoys it, or is 18 or not, or sex trafficked or not, or has a desire to do so. So the questions are not the right ones, because again, there's no follow the money, as you mentioned, et cetera. The huge challenge that we face within New York legislature or government, including the governor's office, is that there is a distinct effort to separate sex trafficking from what they call sex work. So that is impeding health and human services, including services and education to communities and services to survivors. We're not saying that everyone who is in the sex trade has been sex trafficked, although the vast majority fulfill the definitions of human trafficking for sure, but there is a link. So you cannot talk about the sex trade without, or you can't, would not exist without the other. Sex trafficking is just a vehicle through which traffickers bring their prey to the end destination, which is the sex trade. And so that is a serious and imminent challenge, a dangerous challenge that we face as advocates within New York. So an audit of who is educating law enforcement, direct service agencies on how to prevent sex trafficking and how to address the system is really an urgent one, and one we feel we're constantly battling. And then to the question about OnlyFans, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and hopefully now National Organization for Women New York, is about to launch a campaign asking LinkedIn to remove OnlyFans from its platform and including promotional ads that promote OnlyFans. OnlyFans is a prime website that should be examined by the U.S. federal government under the legislation of FOSTA SESTA, which is a malign piece of legislation, but really key in looking at websites that knowingly facilitate sex trafficking and promote prostitution, which is pimping at the federal level. And so, and it should also be noted that the co-founder and head of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, I think is his name,
yes.
is also in the Epstein class. So again, we're looking at corporate structures and corporate policymakers and leaders that are all playing golf together.
Just a word of hope. There are these local businessmen who are not the super rich, but are members of the Rotary and the Lions Club. And John German is here, and he wants to do something. He says maybe training programs for people who wish to understand trafficking and its multiple facets. Also maybe in nail salons, where women can recognize signs of grooming, recruitment, etc. A community awareness program, a helpline where people can report to, and an open letter from Rotary saying they stand with Epstein survivors and asking for investigation of cases where survivors are there. And then he asks if any of you have any other ideas about what Rotary can do. So Raj, I'll give this to you.
Well, I think this notion of obviously civic organizations working in collaboration and making sure that government acts and people in policymaking roles act is vitally important. And it gets, I think, an enormous theme of our incredible discussion today has been the cultural narrative. And so government can go so far. People see policymakers on the front page of the news, but in our communities is Rotary and Lions Club and church groups and civic groups and so on. So I think it is a very important and a great sign if we have civic organizations that are stepping up to the plate. And I think as a matter of political organizing, I said before, focus please on these financial officers, the role that I'm running for. And I will say, again, this is nonpartisan. Early voting for those of you in New York has begun. We are already on day 3, so we have until Sunday to vote at an early voting site, and then election day is next Tuesday, June 23rd. No matter whom you vote for, I hope you get out and vote. But I do believe that you will only get. I'll say this, and for many people who are very involved in the fight for LGBT equality, and so if you think about somebody said that the show Will and Grace might have done more for accepting new norms on sexual identity than 100 politicians blabbing in a legislature, even though ultimately policymakers and the Supreme Court and legislatures had to act. And so I think, again, that's the same concept here, which is we need all hands on deck because this is such a massive crisis. It's a failure of the financial markets. It's a failure of our society. It's a failure of morals, and it's a failure of the political system.
Well said. There's a comment from Petrina Montrose. As a survivor of child sex trafficking into prostitution, involving elite networks and remained in prostitution for over a decade, I think it deeply concerning that financial records, bank transfers, and broader transactional networks can often be traced. Yet those who financed, facilitated, and profited from the abuse are so rarely held accountable. Why are perpetrators and enablers so often insulated from scrutiny while victims and survivors bear the lifelong consequences? Raj, first.
I think at the risk of sort of repeating, which is we just have a lack of political will. And so what we have, of course, and I'll say this, and again, I'm harkening back to Alexi's point about the markets. There's a lot of money being made here. Right? Let's not be, it is a market, and there is on one side of the ledger deep profits. And so whenever there is deep profits, that's a huge failure in this, obviously in our healthcare system and so on. There will be this problem. Now, the political will should be able to break that. And I think we just lack the political will. It is not still a prominent enough issue. We haven't had enough direct action from the political system. And until we have that, we will continue to have these people perpetrate their heinous crimes.
Terry says, as a survivor of prostitution, there is seldom a difference between being called a sex worker or a prostituted woman. The best way to deal with sex trafficking is hold offenders accountable. And then Alina Wheeler asks, there's the view that sex work and prostitution is not work, but is abuse and exploitation. And Charu adds, good evening, everyone. I'm Charu from N Demand, Switzerland. Thank you for the session. One common pattern from Epstein files to other events worldwide is the cost of power that has been over women's bodies. How do you think as a community advocating against sex trafficking and exploitation can work on changing the narrative of normalization of sexualizing women? Taina, do you want to go for that?
This is a 5,000-year struggle, and, you want to end on a hopeful note. Social change is possible. Cultural change is possible. We have seen it in the last few decades with domestic violence, sexual violence, female genital mutilation, child marriage. These were all part of the fabric of society, and a lot of these abuses rested on the notion of consent. And so I think we are really at a ripe moment in society to talk about prostitution as another form of violence. And I think the more, and of course we couldn't do this work without survivors and their leadership and voices. And so the stronger the global movement of survivors becomes, where they can inform policymakers and society about what actually happened to them and who did it to them, I think that the future is bright in getting people to understand that governments need to be held accountable in preventing and ending this human rights abuse.
And then, Raj, there's another question from Professor Ishita Mukhopadhyay, that how would you translate all this into state policy? And I'm going to club it with another question from Lynn, who says that the following the money has worked so far and must be pursued. How would you create an oversight for organizations like JP Morgan, who had and others, besides paying the survivors for enabling Epstein? There must be an oversight process to check which lawmakers have ties with Epstein. And how would you set that up?
Very specifically, I would say two things. One is I put my personal contact information in the chat. If anybody has any more suggestions or wants to be in touch, I'd welcome that. Specifically, there should be an office in the Comptroller's office on sex trafficking. There should be a dedicated resource that is actually, as we've talked about, that leads that audit, the foundational audit. Specifically, I think, as I mentioned, there's money being made. Auditing the financial institutions on this issue, there's many paths to do that. There's many financial regulators. The state comptroller is not actually necessarily a financial regulator. But I do believe, as we've said before, that lifting this with the political will, which is everybody who has a hand in the financial system. I've talked about the pension fund for the comptroller's office and the audit authority, but every state has a financial regulator. And of course, with this federal administration, I don't think I'm very hopeful about what they would do on this issue, given the behavior of the president. But I would say that the financial regulation comes from the federal government. The markets are so regulated. If they took this issue seriously, and I do believe that as we head into the presidential primary for 2028, particularly, I will say this on a partisan level, on the Democratic side, this should be a frontier issue. This should be, in the rise of the Epstein class, a non-negotiable tenet of any major candidate that says that you will, as a regulator of the financial markets, through the SEC, through FINRA, through the CFTC, crack down on this issue and escalate it. That should be a goal of the 28 process. I would humbly suggest to the advocacy movement.
Thank you. There are many more questions, but we're at the end of our hour-long discussion. And Raj, I know you have important work to do, so I will hold you longer. But there is one more question. Perhaps you can read it on chat. Two more, actually. One is from His Excellency Wissam Deodar, who's an ambassador to the UN, and from Suzanne Chiarotti, Lucy Batoy Bertrand. I'm interested in the link between technology and trafficking. What other platforms and avenues do you think politicians should be addressing? Susan is asking about drug lords. And this is one of the problems in Latin America. His Excellency Wissam Deodar is saying, please advise how effective are the anti-human trafficking organizations regarding combating violation of human rights and international laws? Do you think government authorities are really supportive? And Lynn says, thank you, everyone. And on that, I'm going to say thank you to Taina, Alexi, and Raj for this very serious and necessary conversation. Today's discussion began with Epstein, but it cannot end here. The lesson for New York is much larger. Trafficking survives when vulnerable girls are left without safety nets and powerful men are surrounded by systems that protect and enable them. If New York was part of that enabling environment, then New York can become part of the solution. And that means what all the panelists have spoken about today: survivor services that actually reach survivors, housing, legal support, healthcare, education, and economic opportunity, larger budgets, more effective supply chains. It means public contracts that require anti-trafficking safeguards. It means audits that reveal gaps. It means pension and procurement oversight that takes exploitation seriously. It means asking not only who committed the abuse, but who profited, which Raj has emphasized again and again. Who looked away, who moved the money, and who gave cover. At Apne Aap, our NGO, we work with the last girl, the poorest, youngest, most marginalized girl, the one most likely to be bought and sold because she is female, she's poor, she's a teenager. In India, she's from a marginalized caste or tribe. In America, she's very often Black or Native American, and her intersecting inequalities cut her off from many of the life choices that we take for granted. And as budgets are being cut for the most vulnerable, these girls are the most impacted. So we do want the Comptroller office to make sure that services are funded adequately, and traffickers and those who are buying and selling girls are bought to be made accountable and brought to courts, convicted, and made sure that they have to pay not just with light fines, but bigger penalties and bigger financial punishments. Thank you all for joining us. Please continue to follow Apne Aap, CATW, New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition, and the Sanctuary for Families social media handles. Also, do follow Raj Goyle, because I have been following him on Instagram, and I have been seeing a whole walk around New York City and around where he's meeting the most interesting people who are talking about grassroots issues with him. To fight trafficking, New York must follow the money. So thank you, Raj, for taking out time in your important campaign tour to do this roundtable with us. Thank you.
Very grateful to everybody. Thank you.
And thank you, Alexi and Taina, all the survivors who joined us, and people from all over the world. Thank you, friends.